Hi, Sarah. Thanks for being on our show today. I'd like to introduce Sara Flounders. She's the co-coordinator for the International Action Center. She's also a coordinator with UNAC. She's a member of the Veterans for Peace China Working Group, and she's an associate member of Veterans for Peace. Sarah, welcome. And is there anything I missed? I know you do so many things.
Well, right now I'm focused a lot on the Sanctions Kill campaign. The sanctions now on more than 40 countries around the world. Really, a third of the world population is under U.S. sanctions. And we just produced a book here that I edited. I'm just going to hold it up, called Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. And by the way, this is going to be translated into Chinese and come out in China also, and we hope there'll be other translations too. So that's an important project because it is part of the U.S. war on the world to really have a whole role in attempting to wreck the economies of all different countries that present any kind of a threat or where the U.S. wants to bring pressure.
Oh, okay, thank you. And I'd like to mention that Sarah is also the author of this book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, which was written during the height of the COVID crisis, actually, and has a ton of information about what really went on and the lies and the misdirection that the U.S. did that caused over 1 million people in the United States to die of COVID. So thank you for this book as well. Please go ahead.
Well, this seemed like such a good opportunity to discuss, and as part of the work of the China Working Group, which has brought together all kinds of interesting, important information on China and opposing the U.S. war on China and the growing threats on China. So I'm part of the China Working Group, and this is an opportunity for me to really talk about a visit to China in May. We came back June 1st, and it was a very, very important visit. But part of the visit, I think, that I most wanted to discuss was to Xinjiang, because so much of the U.S. propaganda has been focused on Xinjiang. It has become the basis for a whole series of sanctions on China. And there's hardly a day that goes by where it isn't just stated as a fact in the media here that there are concentration camps, slave labor, vast roundups going on in Xinjiang, which is a far northwestern province of China. So we thought it would be important to visit Xinjiang and really see some of that for ourselves. And this was also, we were traveling with Li Su-hin, who is doing a documentary on Xinjiang called Voice of Xinjiang. So he wanted to have some additional footage, and that was also very interesting for us to interview a whole number of people in Xinjiang, from storekeepers to the small farmers, herds people, veterinarian, and so on, to see the cities. We were in Urumqi and in Kashgar. And so let's talk about that first, because as I say, this is a basis of US propaganda. Anyone who's even mentions a criticism of US encirclement, war threats, or sanctions on China is immediately hit with this charge that there's slave labor, it's a vast concentration camp, and so on. And in that sense, I thought our visit really was significant. This is actually called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And it's only 2% of the total population of China lives in this far northwest province. It's really of just a vast, arid, mountainous, high desert region of China. There's 13 different nationalities that are there, a variety of languages, but it's big. It's about a sixth of China's total land, even though it's only 2% of the population. So, as I say, our visit there was to the cities, to urban areas, to rural areas. And the first thing I want to say, because the charge of slave labor and there's images of hand picking of cotton in the fields, China is the largest exporter of cotton in the world. And the US has now totally sanctioned all cotton exports from China. Just to say that the cotton production and all agricultural production in Xinjiang is totally mechanized. I mean, completely. And you can see both tractors, fertilizing equipment, the picking, the pruning, the drones that are spread pesticides and fertilizers. All of this is done in a totally mechanized way. So it's a fabrication that it takes the slave labor. It's a certain amount of highly skilled labor. This is also a region where there used to be herders of camel, of sheep, of goats, covering vast areas, forced to be itinerant, living in yurts. It was hard to educate the children because of the completely transient way of life to keep up with the herds. It's another area where it's now mechanized. They say, well, we can watch our herds from our telephones. It's every animal is wearing a little, connector, and we can herd them with drones. And also the animals a great deal of the time are kept in feeding pens, that the ability of using other agricultural products and the refuse from it into fodder allows farmers to live at home and herders to live at home. We visited a young family. The man was a veterinarian, and he described really in his village there were how to get the shots and immunizations and whatnot that the cattle needed, how to develop new strains, and the village chose him to go to veterinarian school. And then he came back and he had now 5 interns who he in turn was training. Now this was on a big state farm where now each family can choose what they want to farm or animals they want to raise, but they have collective backup. And that was a very interesting structure that we saw. So rather than the Uyghur people being impoverished, isolated population, kept completely ignorant and in concentration camps, there is a whole network of schools, and families are very anxious for their children to go to these schools because they come back able to really apply this new technology in very exciting ways. And so having highly educated children, that was the first thing families bragged about, really. Every family we talked to said, oh, this child and that child, they're in college, they're in university, they're training in this. And also that they had gone for all these different families had gone for skill training and were really more fully participants because Xinjiang, because it was so far and so mountainous and arid, was behind the rest of China in development previously. I'm talking 30 and 40 years ago. Development in China was in the coastal cities. First, largest, most modern in Beijing and Shanghai, which is just an incredible city. You think you're on another planet. Shanghai is so beautiful and so modern. You have a new appreciation of urban life. But anyway, I want to stick with mainly with Xinjiang and our visit there. The cities in Urumqi, so interesting, from the new subway system and electric bus lines, and the downtown modern buildings, modern apartment blocks everywhere. That was really interesting. There's a constant theme in U.S. propaganda that China is destroying all the mosques, that the Muslim Uyghur population of China is having their culture destroyed. We saw mosques everywhere. And there's both Han people from China who came hundreds and hundreds of years ago, who are Muslim. That's the Wei people. And then a whole number of other peoples who, and so even the style of mosques changes between a more Oriental and a more Central Asian style, but mosques are everywhere. As a matter of fact, I just saw an interesting interview with a Palestinian representative who'd been there and said, actually, the number of mosques in Xinjiang exceeds any Islamic country he knew, of the sheer number. And he thought that was an important fact. Now, I think for me, the most important thing, because people can believe or disbelieve what we saw in a few days, but it's to look at the reports, for example, and they're online, they're possible to find, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which represents 57 Islamic countries. And it is, one of the largest intergovernmental organizations in the world. They sent a delegation to Xinjiang just before the pandemic shut down. This is in 2019. And they came back with a congratulatory messages to China in terms of what they had seen, what they had experienced, in terms of culture, life, religious practices, educational levels, health standards, and an integration into modern life, and yet a respect for culture. That was a very interesting report. There was also, just a week after we were in Xinjiang, the League of Arab States, with representatives from 16 Arab countries, Arab Muslim countries, visited Xinjiang, visited actually the two cities where we had also been, major cities, that's Kashgar and Urumqi, and also actually congratulated and praised China, talking about what they had seen, what they had experienced, meetings that they had, villages and countryside where they had gone, families they had met with. So it isn't just what, we saw, and we don't speak either Chinese, nor do we speak Uyghur or any of the languages of China. So we were reliant on translators, and also Li Su-hin was very helpful, but he wasn't the main translator. We were constantly talking to tour guides who were from the local region themselves, both Uyghur and Wei people, who were very excited by what the changes they themselves were experiencing. I'll say also in terms of educational level in Xinjiang, because Xinjiang is now a center of China's vast Belt and Road Initiative, which is to take China's vast goods, largest producer now in the world, into international markets, and also do so in ways that lead to the development of surrounding countries. And so really, China is now a powerhouse in Central Asia and playing an extremely important role. And both Urumqi and Kashgar are each, they're 1,000 miles apart, by the way, but each of them are major hubs in the Belt and Road Initiative that stretches from China's coastal regions and then to Xi'an, which is, fascinating city in itself, 11 million, 12 million people, and to Beijing, to Shanghai, to Nanjing, to all the different cities of China's eastern region. Now, Xinjiang has 4,000 years of culture, of history, of early civilizations, and there really is an effort everywhere in museums and exhibits and whatnot to display that, to make it part of what people are very proud of in China today and in Xinjiang as a region. They will constantly raise past civilizations, what they had contributed, and I think that's something we found everywhere in China, a real appreciation of the thousands of years of history that you can find everywhere. So I don't know, maybe you have questions, because I'm going on a long time here on some of these points. But the one thing I really will stress is that there is no Arab or Muslim country that have joined in this U.S. attack on China, particularly on the stories of repression of the people in Xinjiang, particularly the Uyghur, who are a Muslim population, not the only Muslim population, but a Muslim population in China. And where do the stories come from? That's important, because these are all almost entirely from National Endowment for Democracy, which is another form of CIA funding. So the World Uyghur Congress and all of these organizations, they have the same address as Human Rights Watch. They're just another desk in the operation. And it's important, because you have to know where information is coming from, and how Radio Free Asia just recycles it, just reprints constant press releases, gets it out, and it's recycled by the media here as genuine stories. And none of the stories that are so easily found around the world, not only in Chinese media, but really throughout the world, will you find in the US media here. They're just censored out. So where is the censorship? It's right here. And it's used to justify whether it's sanctions on China's chip technology or China's cotton products. It's part of the same plan to attempt to stop China's development, because that's threatening to the US.
Okay, thanks a lot. I appreciate that description. I had heard and read about before that the Muslim countries had sent delegations to Xinjiang on more than one occasion, and they all came back with praise for what China is doing, and they all, rejected the US media story that there's slave labor and there's all this stuff. And the fact that no Muslim country will back up America's claims, I think is very significant, since, many of the Muslim countries have shown independence from, not just the US, but all other foreign influences. And shown that they're willing to state their opinions up front, regardless of who disagrees with them. So the fact that they have praise rather than condemnation for China's policies in Xinjiang, I think is very telling. Since you mentioned Shanghai and how advanced it is, I just couldn't resist telling a little story. When I visited Shanghai once with a group of Chinese that I was touring China with, Chinese Americans, there were two retired women judges that were among our group and were leaders of the group. And one day they both decided when we were in Shanghai that they wanted to go to this particular part of Shanghai that they said was the worst part of Shanghai because they could shop for bargains there. So I was very eager to see, after seeing all the nice parts of Shanghai and how modern it was, and in many ways even more modern than cities in the United States. I'm in San Francisco. So I was eager to see what the worst part looked like. And when we went there, you know what it looked like? Chinatown, San Francisco. So it's like the worst part of Shanghai looked just like San Francisco. But anyway, let me get on to the next question. Yellen and Blinken and others have recently visited China and talked with top leaders in China. What are your thoughts on their visits and what came out of those visits?
These visits by top US officials, each of them were quite threatening and intended to be threatening to China, telling China what the US expected them to do, as if they were speaking simply to a supplicant state. I mean, this is like images out of 100 years ago, the sheer arrogance of it, where officials don't go to have a person-to-person meeting, but they arrive with demands and their own agenda. That's important. Janet Yellen, who is a very important voice and force in her own right. She headed the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and she's a former chair of the Federal Reserve, and she's taught economics at Harvard and Yale and the London School of Economics. So her words carry weight. And the first thing she does is have a meeting with the Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. And she says to them, and she had released a report a couple of months before her visit, saying this is an anticipation of her visit. And what should China do to end the sanctions and to rectify relations? They should move to a market economy. Now, just first of all, the sheer arrogance of that, and telling China, this you'll be richer for this, because capitalism solves more problems. And from there, she just sort of bounced into that was how 800 million people were, poverty was ended. That was socialism in China. It was state planning that ended poverty for millions, 800 million people. And we all know that capitalism has not done that anywhere on the planet, including here in the US. Capitalism doesn't end poverty. It maximizes immediate profit for those who own the resources and the industries. That's the purpose of capitalism. It's how it functions. So Janet Yellen goes to tell China they should move to a market economy. But it shows a lot, her statements, as to why the United States and the G7 are so threatened by China. It's not only China's vast productive capacity and that it is exceeding the United States and the US and the G7 put together. It's not just that China is a rising power. It is that it is organized on a different basis. and what is publicly owned and used for the common good. The banks are not privately owned as they are in the US. That means the billionaires of the banks, they only want to maximize profit. They'll engage in every speculative deal, but the vast profits owned go into their pocket. It's not true in China. All banking in China is state-owned and administered and organized. It's the same thing with key industries and with railroads and with chemicals and of the electrification. These things are owned by the state, and the profits that are generated from them go to further development of infrastructure in China. Now, that makes a big difference, and it's a big threat to the US economy, to the multi-billionaires here. They can't own the most profitable things in China. They can go and set up plants in China to take advantage of lower rates payment of labor, which is quickly going up. You know, here in the US, as every worker knows, the real paycheck hasn't caught up 40 years. I mean, we still have the same minimum wage of decades ago. In China, wages are going up 5 to 7% a year, and oftentimes more. And they have moved from a low wage to a medium tier economy in terms of what workers earn. So that's a big change too. It means that there's a real identification in China and among the whole working class of peasants of constantly improving visually, visibly, what's in your pocket, what's in your savings, what's in the conditions of life, improving every single year. And here we know there is a real deterioration. So it has a lot to do with how people identify with their country, participate in the economy and in political and national life. Now, would that alone be threatening? There are other things that Janet Yellen, Blinken also said they wanted changed. They consider that China is stealing US technology because of the conditions that China has set down. If you want to open a plant here in China, we'll lease you the land. Land is nationally owned. It can't be bought or sold ever, but it can be leased. We'll lease you the land. You can bring in the equipment, but you have to train Chinese workers, not only the workers, but also the management. You have to share the blueprints. And when you leave, or when the terms of the lease are up, China owns that equipment. Now that's entirely different. In the US, when a plant wants to leave, they just pick up, take their equipment, and leave the shell of an industry. You can look at the Rust Belt across the Midwest to know that that's true. They're whole industries that they just look like looted old decaying buildings now with signs flapping in the wind. Everything is gone. You can't do that in China. And so the US considers that theft of material that they own. Even though they signed these agreements, if you want to set up a plant here, you have co-owners, and you have to meet the conditions that the workers raise. So workers can raise real grievances in every plant, and the Chinese state doesn't step in to guarantee the capitalists. They leave that up to the capitalists to deal with their workers. So this is why wages continue to go up, and the conditions are much safer than when this whole process began, when all that China, we're talking 40 years ago, had to offer was the low wage of workers who had skills, who had job discipline, who had great enthusiasm, but the wages were low. So that has changed, and the US doesn't like that change at all. They want it back to a low-wage workforce where they can just also threaten to pick up and move to Bangladesh or Vietnam or Thailand or other places and raise that as a constant threat over the workers. So that's what they mean when they say there's theft, intellectual property theft of US industries and technology. But there are agreements that the US signed because they wanted the immediate profits of, from the labor of Chinese workers. So the other thing that is found so threatening, in my opinion, is that there's centralized planning. There's not only state ownership, but there's centralized planning. And we've seen here in the US when there's a capitalist crisis, such as in 2008, it's not the workers who get bailed out. Maybe they'll get a few months of unemployment insurance, but with literally trillions of dollars, I think $16 trillion was pumped into US banks in 2008, 2009. Bankers, privately owned bankers, get bailed out. In China, capitalists were on their own, but the money from these state-owned industries went into a huge number of China infrastructure programs. So all sorts of local or international capitalists took a bath during that period. They sure did. And they weren't bailed out by the Chinese state, but Chinese workers went into whole new industries. And that a great deal of this exciting rail transport was developed in that time, infrastructure of ports and harbors and roads, but especially the railroad infrastructure, the bullet trains, the subway lines. Every Chinese city, it is incredible, 16, 18 new subway lines. I'm not talking about subway stops, because here in New York, they spent 50 years building the Second Avenue subway line. They ended up just shortening it anyway. Couldn't seem to do it. But in China, the subways are gorgeous. Every city, I would want to take the subway. Riding around in a van is interesting, but I want to see what the subways are like. And they're fabulous, modern, clean. Every subway station has working, clean, 24-hour staffed bathrooms, toilet facilities, well lit, usually with flower displays and staff. It's quite incredible. Anyway, the subway lines in China are really exciting in themselves. You can go into a city of just a couple of million, or cities of 10 million, 15 million, and there's subway lines to every possible housing complex, university center, and whatnot. And they're fun to take and easy. And the signs are in Chinese and English. So that was always interesting for us too. Could we navigate this? You know, and they're not hard to navigate, actually. So that's part of. I got off track a little bit about what the U.S. wants changed in China, and China isn't about to give, because China had, you know, about 150 years of what was called unequal treaties, and this is how the U.S. and France and Britain and Germany and Belgium and Italy and Spain, they're used to doing business, and Japan. You come with the demands, ridiculous, offensive demands, and you say, this is what we want, this port, this harbor, this extraction, these mines, these industries. And if you don't, it's backed up by the US Navy, had an entire fleet of ships that patrolled China's rivers 1,000 miles inland, the US fleets. If you didn't like a deal with a local capitalist, you just blasted their warehouse until conditions were met. That's the old way of United States and Britain and other countries doing business in China, unequal treaties, that century of humiliation. Well, China's not going back to that. And they are determined to use their influence now and their state and the cohesion they have to have favorable terms for the whole Chinese people. And that is a new day. So they can listen to this. They will receive Blinken or Yellen, but they're not going back to 1840, where opium had an open market in the name of free trade, and freedom of navigation meant Western ships in the canals and rivers and coastal waters of China. They're not going back to that. So, and they're very proud that they're not. That's asserted constantly, that, US, other countries can come here for trade. We have a great deal of it. We have a lot to offer, though people will say, but we set the conditions, and the conditions are not going to be set by forces coming in. So there's constantly, we're open to business, we're open to trade. That was never said that they wanted to cut things with the US. They don't. But they do feel they have a right to their own economy, and also they have a right to trade with other countries around the world. The idea that they should respect US imposed sanctions on other countries, how offensive and arrogant is that? The US Congress passes sanctions, whether it's on Venezuela or Zimbabwe, Cuba or Ethiopia or Eritrea, and that China should just salute and cut off trade relations? No, they're not going to do that. And that really came to the sharp when the US imposed thousands and thousands of sanctions against Russia and demanded, insisted that China respect these US and European Union sanctions. And China said, no, we have pre-existing contracts and trade, and they'll continue. They're not seeking to confront the US on this, but they are interested in continuing normal trade. That's a big shock, because it means that these imperialist countries are no longer the ones calling the shots. It's very frustrating for them. Used to be, if they declared sanctions on a country, and it could be a country landlocked, isolated, such as Mali, they expect every country in the world to agree. And that's not what's happening anymore. And so, we have to look at that difference. There's the centralized planning. There's a state ownership of vital industries. There are lots of capitalists in China. That's the other thing you could really see. There are lots of also small capitalists. Any city that you're in, all kinds of fruit and vegetable and clothing and knickknacks and shopping areas. These are all, small capitalists. There's other big capitalists. But here, I would say in the United States, it's workers who are always on a leash, controlled by the state. Even the railroad workers, they can't go on strike. No. The conditions, the terms are set. In China, it's the capitalists who are on the leash. Yes, great profits that they can have, but they are expected to abide by China's laws and to work in concert with both the state-owned industries and general central plans, and to apply China's labor laws, which are becoming increasingly higher and higher standards, and environmental laws. There's probably more electric vehicles in China. There are actually more electric vehicles in China than in the rest of the world put together. And there are whole cities, which are green cities now, and you really hear it, or you don't hear it. Traffic noise in China is almost non-existent. It's very interesting how a densely populated city operates at a quieter level than just the sheer level of noise that we're used to, I'm in New York most days, and the level of traffic noise around can be pretty heavy. And we're also used to seeing a level of police and military that is on every corner and in the subway lines and so on. For all the talk of repression in China, that's not what you see at all. And it's an interesting comparison, including in Xinjiang, that we heard was under martial law and a police state. I see and experience far more police and military and state police and transit police and whatnot in the US than I saw anywhere in China. So these are differences that you notice in terms of clean cities, quiet cities, extremely modern cities with new subway and transit lines and bullet trains and so on. And a big attention on how to integrate the entire population. It doesn't happen evenly. I just want to say that, because, as I say, there are millionaires and multimillionaires in China. There are people still above the poverty level, but just barely. But not only every city, but every district has both community kitchens, attention on housing. You don't see homeless people. I didn't see anywhere, and I was on the lookout. Just what's taken for granted here, you don't see in China. And that makes a real impact when so anyway, you probably have other questions. I'm going far afield here. But it's part of, China in a new multipolar world. There are other developing countries too, and that's a big frustration of the US. They're used to setting the terms of the contracts, the agreements, and telling countries what to do, and that's not happening anymore.
Yes, when I was in China, I remember seeing how modern it was, and like in so many ways, like when you were talking about the subways, I've been in those subways. They're much cleaner and faster and more efficient than ours, and you can walk around the streets at night. You don't worry about being jumped. The police most of the time do not carry guns. It was very rare to see any guns in China. I mean, I saw one gun at airports occasionally in the hands of a soldier there. There was one time at a train station where there were some police with guns because of terrorist incidents. But most of the time, you see police walking around. They have like one of those collapsible batons and a small holster on their belt. That's it,
Right.
And it's so modern there. It's like when I come back to the United States, I feel like, I just stepped from the future back into the past, and it's like, all of a sudden where I live is a third world country, not China. It used to be the reverse. So those are really kind of eye-opening experiences if you go to China for the first time and you've never been there before. It's like stepping into the future, some of the places that you see in China. And there are some still old places. I've been out to the countryside and I've seen where, it was in transition. This was a few years ago, where you could see old housing next to new housing, and you could see that they were building new housing and that things were getting more modern as time goes on. And you talk to the people there, because I traveled with Chinese Americans who were originally from Hong Kong or Taiwan or the mainland, and we're going back together. So we have people who talk to the locals just like the Chinese to Chinese in their native language. And what people report is that year by year things steadily get better. So anyway, those are just eye-opening experiences for people who've never been to China before. But let me move on a bit. Do you want to say anything about the Belt and Road and kind of give a kind of a broad picture of what that is to people who may not know much about it, and give your observations on it.
Yeah, actually, the Belt and Road is pretty interesting. It's the biggest infrastructure program in world history. That's not an exaggeration. I mean, it's trillions of dollars in terms of a program to bring technology and infrastructure and modernization to other countries. And it really is transformative in incredible ways. Now, at the same time, China has this policy. I was trying to understand it, called win-win in their relations with other countries. What does win-win mean? When they're meeting with another country, the officials, a delegation, they may ask them, what are the 10 things that they'd like to see most, or sort of at the top of their agenda. Now, China also presents what are the 10 things that are in China's interests in terms of their exchange with this country. And then they see which of the two things kind of match, which would be of benefit to both countries. That's what they mean by win-win. And that's an interesting way of even doing diplomacy. And it's that way on almost everything. Whereas, as I say, the imperialist way is, here's what we want, you comply. And that only creates resentment. Now it's 10 years since the Belt and Road Initiative. And as I say, it's the largest infrastructure development project they say in history. More than 10 times what the Marshall Plan was at the end of World War II, which was a plan which did re-industrialize and develop industries that had been destroyed in Western Europe. That's true, but in US interests, new US ownership, and it was of short life. And this is, as I say, 10 times the size, and the US has nothing in comparison that it can offer. And the idea is to enhance connectivity and to promote economic development. And what are the ports, the rail hubs, the transportation centers? And not only that, but what are needed in terms of schools and skill sets and training that go along with this. You can't just bring technology into a poor and underdeveloped area and expect people to greet it with applause if it's foreign workers coming in, unless they're part of this structure, this training. It's of very little interest and actually can be a source of resentment. So an important part of the Belt and Road is also consciously raising the educational and skill and health standards of the surrounding region to set up real transit hubs along new rail lines and port lines, and to help the development of new industries. This also, just in concrete terms, vastly increases the size of the working class. China does not interfere in the internal developments of any countries. That's very unlike US policy, but they see this as economic. They're not coming in with military aid. It is their emphasis is on economic development as being a real change, and what will do a lot to undercut the tensions and the war in whole regions. That if everyone is benefiting in a new way, this will have real plan. Now, the US also denounces this as potentially a debt trap. For example, they say it'll be a debt trap in Africa. Only 8% of the total debt in Africa is held by China. and on long, extended, and infrastructure terms. When the US says they want China's help in debt repayment, is they want China's money to go for repayment of Western debts. And China is determined that what's coming in is for development, not to pay off Western banks. So that's an important thing just to keep in mind, too. Now, there's so much could be said about the Belt and Road and what it's meant in different countries, what it's meant, whether it's in Ethiopia or Somalia or, one country after another, what it means in Venezuela, different countries. It is the ability, though, for each country to have more control over their own economy. So sovereignty is an important part of it, and why it's very much appreciated by a number of countries. They're no longer just exporting raw materials, but can that refining be done in country? Now, considering Niger today and their demands, they've been shipping uranium to France for 60 years, raw, unfinished uranium. And France then resells the same material at about 10 times the price. France then is the owner of it. And then it gets refined in France. So France has full electrification, and Niger, 85% of the population doesn't yet have electricity, even though they're mining the uranium that makes the nuclear energy in France that makes electrification possible. So that's the unequal relations that existed throughout Africa, throughout Asia, and Latin America, and where, with a country working out what are the raw materials you have that, if they were refined or semi-refined here before export, would vastly increase the value, even in the world market, not just the China market, but that changes the relations in a big way. So I think that's an important part of the Belt and Road too. It's constantly raising the development level of other countries and the communication levels. A railroad coming in isn't just the end line. It's a whole series of hubs along the way where industries will then be built. It's water purification projects and pumping and wells. It's dams. Countries controlling water supply is absolutely vital. Can be used for energy, used for irrigation. It's essential. The control of water, the control of land and resources, but particularly the ability to what you have to sell on the world market increases in value if it can be refined or semi-refined, and that is what China is helping to do.
Okay, let's see. Lastly, the New York Times recently had a hit piece on Tricontinental, which is a organization that talks a lot about the Third World as well as China, on Code Pink, especially their China is Not Our Enemy campaign, and No Cold War, which is a British organization that advocates an end to the new Cold War on the world, basically. I know that you saw this hit piece and you have some comments on it. Can you tell us your observations about this New York Times hit piece on these three very prominent peace organizations?
Well, it is true that this is the new McCarthyite tactics, which absolutely controlled. When we say McCarthyite, in the 1950s in the US, anyone who opposed the Cold War, anyone who opposed the demonization of the Soviet Union, anyone who was for peace was considered a foreign agent. And that term was used again and again. And there were hundreds of people who were jailed, who were driven out, who were deported and so on. Families broken up, people in the thousands fired from jobs. That was the McCarthy period. Have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? That became a way of saying you're an agent of a foreign power. And that is really when you see this New York Times, and it's being followed up with articles in a number of other publications claiming that there are foreign agents who have made grants. Now, really what they are is the person that they were targeting, Singman, is a US citizen and made the money in US software programs and is dispensing it to US and international groups. Has nothing to do with money from China. But their message is China's not our enemy. And I absolutely believe that's true. So I think, first of all, it's important for organizations around the United States to denounce that article and all of these tactics because it is leading to complete repression of political life, discussions such as we're having. It's meant to target that right away. And to say that anyone who doesn't go along with US sanctions, US propaganda, US military encirclement, US military batteries, US aircraft carriers in the Taiwan Straits and the coastal waters of China, anyone who criticizes that, questions it, is a Chinese agent. It's wild, ridiculous fabrication. These are really courageous people who are saying publicly, China isn't our enemy, and no to a Cold War. And we need the resources and money for war, which is private profit for the biggest corporations. We need that money spent right here for infrastructure in the US. And it's not, it never is. To balance the budget and the military budget, which is, I say, biggest source of private profit, everything else is being looted. The student loan, the student debt forgiveness that was guaranteed, it was going to happen by the Biden administration. Who's seen it? A little bit, who can apply for it, how much it is. Everything that was promised has gone down. There just isn't the money for that. But there is some money for aircraft carriers and missile batteries. And that is really further and further impoverishing for working people in the US. And we need to stand up to it. And we also need to support the people who are providing interesting information. And when you look at the New York Times doing an expose like that, this multi-million-dollar media conglomerate who has so much resources, and New York Times has entire buildings and networks and very highly paid reporters and journalists and so on. They're going to criticize a small handful of people putting out on social media a counter narrative that China isn't our enemy, and accepting grants from someone who's paid their money in the US and is a US citizen, has every right to make grants. So we need to stand up to it, sign the petitions, sign the statements, and do as much of this as we can with our small resources. So I think there's no crime in anything that has been done. The crime is in saying that these very courageous journalists should be considered agents of a foreign power because they're not towing the propaganda line. So I think standing up to it is important. Standing up to the lies not only against China. At another point, other people are being attacked for standing up and criticizing NATO and the US-NATO war and continued war in Ukraine. That's another hot button issue where to criticize to defend Cuba and to criticize the blockade of Cuba, the sanctions and blockade of Venezuela, Nicaragua, all of the people who are doing real investigative media work, visits, and extending solidarity to these countries are suddenly coming under increasing scrutiny and attack. And saying no to that and building common defense, I think, is extremely important to do, because people have to hear the real news and to know what the rest of the world knows. Here, where there's greater and greater isolation, you have media that you can Google in an article and you will only see reprinted 10 different ways the same news stories from US corporate media, sometimes some British articles, sometimes some, but you won't see the huge media that other countries have and are engaging in. And we have every right to have that. Even if we're going to understand questions in the environment. Now, China is constantly attacked on environmental and climate issues. And yet, when you compare it, the US is far more, and historically past, but also present, doing far more damage to the climate than China. With China has more than 4 times the population and is doing much more in terms of greening. It's another area where the U.S. is trying to stop the solar panels, the solar energy, the everything that's being done to help in environmental and climate change protection that China has developed is suddenly being cut off of markets here. It's another form of the sanctions, and it is damaging to the whole world. So we got to stand up. If you're interested in the climate, you got to look at who is producing solar panels really for the whole world, and hydropower and electric power, water power, wind power, in new and exciting ways. That is one other thing I should just mention, traveling in China. Let me bounce back to that. And that is the greening in China. There are billions of trees. You won't pass a vacant lot, the land along subway and elevated trains and railroads and downtown cities everywhere is a vast tree planting project in China, and the water and drip lines and everything to keep greenery thriving. Every city we visited in China had the most interesting greening plans. Cities compete with each other on the best plans. It's changing the terrain. We went to Yan'an, which was once the head of the Red Army during the liberation struggle in China. Now, you read Edgar Snow or any of the descriptions during China's liberation struggle. This was an arid, rocky region. People lived in caves, whole hillsides, barren. Literally, the environment has changed. It's the hills, everything are now covered in greenery. It has changed in many ways. China dealing with the levels of smog in Beijing, which was a real problem 10 years ago even, whole months of the year. And now through real planning, centralized planning in a very organized way, greenery has returned, and it's done a lot. And it's not only the trees planted in Beijing, but trees planted all the way up into the steppes that are changing the terrain. So that's an important part of the, and China has also made it part of the Belt and Road plans, that when you bring infrastructure to a region, you try to do remediation in terms of water, of erosion, of plant life, because the world we live in, the planet it's so important. Now, I do want to compare that to US figures, which are so fraudulent in terms of climate and carbon emissions. Ever since the Kyoto Accords, it was agreed by all the countries of the world that all US military carbon emissions would be not included in the figures. Now, that means all US bases, means all aircraft carriers, destroyers, ships around the world. It means all jet aircraft. It means the carbon emissions on 800 bases. It means the carbon emissions from US wars and bombing in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Yugoslavia, now in Ukraine. That's not counted in terms of carbon emissions. So when you take that out of the equation, you have totally distorted figures. It looks like the US is doing better than it really is. And part of our demands, even on climate, should be to include all US emissions, especially including the military carbon highly toxic emissions. Then we'll have a more accurate picture, and that's what really has to be brought under control. So sorry to mix that into this, but I wrote in my notes here, I didn't want to let that go because it's an issue that comes up all the time. But we should close on standing up to the climate, this effort to frighten people, both with propaganda, and then to say that anyone who counters that propaganda, they're the ones telling the lies. Point the fingers at them. They're the ones who, even at great risk, are telling another side to the reality happening in the world and giving first-person pictures. I saw such an interesting video yesterday that Michael Campbell, who is the Nicaraguan ambassador to China, put up on YouTube, and also was picked up on Chinese media, but was picked up by people around the world because he was visiting Xinjiang and with a whole delegation from Latin America, and talking about what a vibrant area it is, and culturally how much he saw and experienced. So it was interesting to me that there was a whole Latin American delegation, and to see Michael Campbell there from Nicaragua, small country that can be isolated. In Nicaragua, they describe that when they meet with people from China, it's very different from meeting with US corporate demanders, US officials, that they're able to have, even though they're a very small country, especially compared to China's size, they're treated as equals. And that makes a big impact. Makes a big impact when a country, whether it's Barbados or Palestine, goes to China and receives a state welcome. And that's what Blinken was so resentful that he didn't get. So, you know, there's new dimensions in diplomacy happening too that we should really look at how it resonates for these countries that see there can be new relations and new forms of exchange, and countries that are listening to their needs, even if they're very small. They have their own development plans and sovereignty that they want.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That was great. For people who want to do something, there are petitions up on both the Code Pink website and on the People's Forum website, pushing back against the New York Times hit piece. So if you go to those websites and just look for that petition, they're interested in having both people and organizations sign on. Okay, Sarah, any last words before we close?
Well, I want to really thank the China Working Group for the real work that you do, both within Veterans for Peace, but in a wider way also. There's plans for Veterans for Peace from the China Working Group to have a delegation to China. I think that's important. The more people that are willing to travel to China, I'll thank the China-US Solidarity Network and Li Su-hin for the trip that he helped us arrange. And there are a number of ways to visit China, but I would say every one of them, this is worth the time and the energy and the resources, because then you come back with your own experiences. Thank you for this opportunity. That's actually what I'm doing. I'm talking to people. We have a number of really discussions. I can't say that they're lectures. It's more like our impressions of what we saw. And can we, through these, show people that there is another reality. But some of it you really have to see, because you feel like you're visiting a different planet, a different reality than what you see here. And you have a different picture also of, there is a real racism that just permeates every country that the US targets in the way that they demonize. And so the anti-China characterizations and anti-Asian racism, I think, have to be met head on, because it's so part of the culture here that they only have to push a button to get it to erupt. I think that's important to recognize and to really confront.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, I agree. I think, I've always recommended that people, if they get a chance, go to China, see for yourself. Don't worry about what anybody's propaganda says. Go see for yourself, even if you just take a 2-week vacation and do nothing more than sign up for a regular, tourist agency, travel agencies tour of China, and, see all the tourist spots. And even just driving through the cities, you'll see a lot. It'll be a real eye opener. And I think you'll see what China's really like without all the noise from, anybody's propaganda. Okay, let's call it a wrap. Thanks a lot. I really
Okay,
appreciate
thank
your
you.
taking the time, Sarah.
And thank you for taking the time.
Oops, I didn't start a recording.